The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Sentinel as Private First Class Emma Rodriguez dragged her duffel bag through the dusty compound. The bag was too heavy for her small frame, and she stumbled slightly as she made her way toward the barracks. Behind her, a chorus of snickers erupted from the group of soldiers lounging near the ammunition depot. "Would you look at that?" Sergeant Tommy Walsh called out, his voice carrying deliberately across the courtyard. "They sent us a Girl Scout to fight the Taliban. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." His squad burst into laughter, phones appearing instantly to capture the moment of Emma struggling with her gear. "Maybe she's got cookies in that bag," added Corporal Mike Stevens, slapping his knee. "Hope she brought enough for the whole platoon." Emma kept walking, her jaw set in determination, but her cheeks burned with embarrassment. She had heard it all before during basic training, during advanced infantry training, and now here in Afghanistan. The jokes, the whispers, the sideways glances that said she didn't belong in a combat zone. What they didn't know was that Emma Rodriguez carried more than just gear in that heavy bag. She carried the weight of expectations, the burden of proving herself worthy of the uniform she wore, and secrets that would have shocked them into silence if they only knew the truth. But secrets, like courage, have a way of revealing themselves when the moment demands it. And Emma's moment was coming sooner than anyone could have imagined. Emma Rodriguez was the kind of soldier who seemed to disappear into the background of any formation. At 23 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a slight build that made her standard-issue body armor appear oversized on her frame. Her dark hair was always pulled back in the regulation bun, so tight it seemed to stretch her features into a perpetual expression of nervous alertness. She had the kind of face that might have been pretty under different circumstances, but here at Forward Sentinel, prettiness was a liability she couldn't afford. Her uniform was always immaculate, pressed to perfection despite the constant dust and heat of the Afghan desert. While other soldiers allowed their gear to show the wear of deployment, Emma's equipment remained spotless, organized with a precision that bordered on obsessive. Her rifle was cleaned daily, her boots polished to a mirror shine, and her personal area maintained with the discipline of someone who believed that control over small things might translate to control over larger ones. The other soldiers in Bravo Company had taken to calling her Mouse within her first week at the base. The nickname wasn't meant as endearment. It was a reference to the way she seemed to scurry from place to place, avoiding confrontation, keeping her head down, speaking only when spoken to. During meals, she sat alone at the far end of the dining facility, methodically eating her mar-ease while the rest of the company shared stories and jokes at the crowded center tables. Her daily routine was as predictable as clockwork. Every morning at 05:00 hours, she would emerge from the female quarters and begin her physical training routine on the makeshift running track that circled the base perimeter. She ran alone, maintaining a steady pace that was neither fast enough to impress nor slow enough to draw criticism. Her form was textbook perfect, her breathing controlled, but there was something almost mechanical about the way she moved, as if she was going through the motions of being a soldier rather than truly embodying the role. After her run, she would disappear into the supply depot where she worked as a logistics specialist. The depot was a maze of shipping containers and prefabricated buildings filled with everything from ammunition to toilet paper. It was unglamorous work, the kind of assignment that ambitious soldiers avoided, but Emma seemed to thrive in the ordered chaos of inventory management and requisition forms. She had a gift for remembering where everything was stored, could calculate supply requirements in her head with calculator-like precision, and had never once filed an incorrect report. Captain Lisa Harper, the company's supply officer, had initially been skeptical of Emma's assignment to her section. "Rodriguez seems competent enough, she had told First Sergeant Williams during Emma's first week. "But she's so quiet, I sometimes forget she's there. In a combat zone, invisible might be good for some jobs, but I need people who can speak up when something's wrong." Emma's fellow soldiers had their own opinions about their newest member. During evening downtime, when the temperature dropped enough to make sitting outside bearable, they would gather in small groups to play cards, share care packages from home, or simply complain about the heat, the food, and the endless uncertainty of deployment life. Emma was never part of these gatherings. She would retreat to her bunk with a book or a tablet, creating a bubble of solitude that others seemed reluctant to penetrate. "She's probably writing poetry or something," Specialist Janet Chen had joked one evening, nodding toward Emma's corner of the barracks. "I bet she's got a whole journal full of feelings about how mean we all are to her." The truth was more complex than any of them realized. Emma did keep a journal, but it wasn't filled with hurt feelings or romantic poetry. Instead, she recorded detailed observations about the base's defensive positions, noted patterns in enemy activity based on intelligence briefings, and analyzed the tactical strengths and weaknesses of different areas around the perimeter. She studied military history with the intensity of a graduate student, reading about famous battles and defensive actions on her tablet late into the night. Her academic approach to warfare was seen as another sign of her unsuitability for combat. During training exercises, she would often pause to consult her notebook or reference manual, earning eye rolls from instructors who valued instinct over intellect. "This isn't a library, Rodriguez," Sergeant Walsh had barked during one particularly frustrating drill. "When bullets start flying, you won't have time to look up the answer in a book." The mockery reached new heights during her first month when the company participated in a combat simulation exercise. The scenario was designed to test the unit's response to a coordinated attack on the base, with role players acting as enemy forces attempting to breach the perimeter. Emma was assigned to a defensive position on the eastern wall, paired with Corporal Danny Martinez, a seasoned soldier who had already completed 2 combat deployments. From the beginning, it was clear that Martinez had little confidence in his partner. "Just stay low and try not to get in the way," he had instructed as they took their positions. "If things get hairy, I'll handle the shooting. You focus on keeping me supplied with ammunition." The exercise began at dawn, with the enemy forces launching a coordinated assault from multiple directions. The base's defenders were equipped with training ammunition and laser tag systems that registered hits and misses. Emma found herself frozen in place as the simulation began, overwhelmed by the chaos of shouting voices, simulated explosions, and the rapid crack of blank ammunition. Martinez was in his element, methodically engaging targets with the calm precision of an experienced soldier. But Emma seemed paralyzed, crouched behind the sandbags with her rifle unfired, her eyes wide with what appeared to be fear. When Martinez called for more ammunition, she fumbled with the magazine, her hands shaking as she tried to reload. "Rodriguez!" Martinez shouted over the noise. "What are you doing? Move!" But Emma remained frozen, her weapon pointed at the ground, her body pressed as low as possible against the fortified position. To the observers and her fellow soldiers, it looked like textbook panic, a complete breakdown under simulated combat stress. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The exercise lasted 4 hours, and by the end, Emma had fired fewer than 10 rounds. Her performance report was devastating. "Private Rodriguez showed signs of combat stress during simulation," the instructor wrote. "Recommend additional training and psychological evaluation before consideration for combat duties." The aftermath was worse than the exercise itself. Within hours, word had spread throughout the company about Emma's performance. The nickname Mouse was replaced with something more cruel: Frozen. Soldiers would make exaggerated shivering motions when she passed, or would suddenly stop talking when she entered a room, as if her presence might somehow contaminate them with her supposed cowardice. Sergeant Walsh took particular pleasure in Emma's apparent weakness. During the next morning's formation, he made sure to position her in the front row where everyone could see her. "I want to talk about yesterday's exercise," he announced to the assembled company. "Most of you performed admirably. You showed courage, initiative, and the kind of fighting spirit that makes America proud." His eyes found Emma in the formation, and his voice took on a harder edge. "But some of you forgot why you're here. Some of you seem to think this was a game, that you could just hide behind the sandbags and let others do the fighting for you." The implied accusation was clear, and Emma felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her back. The psychological pressure was relentless. During meals, conversations would stop when she approached. In the barracks, she would find her gear mysteriously rearranged or her personal items accidentally knocked to the floor. Someone had started a betting pool about whether she would request a transfer to a non-combat role, with odds heavily favoring her departure within the month. Emma's work performance in the supply depot remained exemplary, but even there she began to feel the isolation. Other soldiers who came to requisition supplies would make jokes about her combat readiness, asking if she needed extra blankets to keep from shivering or suggesting that she might be more comfortable in the rear, with the gear instead of on the front lines. Captain Harper began to notice the change in Emma's demeanor. While she had always been quiet, now she seemed almost ghostly, moving through her duties with mechanical precision but no apparent engagement. "Are you okay, Rodriguez?" she asked. One afternoon, after noticing Emma staring blankly at a supply manifest for several minutes without moving. "I'm fine, ma'am," Emma replied, but her voice was flat, empty of the quiet confidence she had shown during her first weeks at the base. "Just tired." The truth was that Emma was fighting a war within herself that had nothing to do with the Taliban or the mission in Afghanistan. Every night, she would lie in her bunk and replay the simulation in her mind, analyzing what had happened and why she had reacted the way she did. The other soldiers thought she had frozen from fear, but Emma knew the truth was more complicated. She had been overwhelmed not by terror, but by the sheer volume of tactical information flooding her mind during the exercise. While Martinez had been focused on engaging targets, Emma had been processing the entire battlefield, tracking the movement of all enemy forces, calculating angles of attack, and identifying weaknesses in their defensive position. Her mind had been racing at light speed, but to outside observers, she had appeared paralyzed. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Emma understood that her brain worked differently than those of her fellow soldiers. Where they relied on instinct and training, she processed combat as a complex mathematical equation with variables that needed to be calculated and optimized. But understanding this difference didn't make it any easier to live with the consequences. The isolation began to affect her performance in other areas. Her morning runs became slower and more labored, as if she was carrying an invisible weight. That grew heavier each day. Her meticulous attention to detail in the supply depot began to slip, and she made small errors that would have been unthinkable during her first month. First Sergeant Williams noticed the change and called her into his office on a humid Tuesday afternoon. The office was a cramped space carved out of a shipping container, with maps of the local area covering the walls and a single desk fan providing inadequate relief from the oppressive heat. "Sit down, Rodriguez," Williams said, gesturing to a metal folding chair across from his desk. He was a career soldier with 22 years of service, and his weathered face showed the accumulated stress of multiple deployments. "I want to talk to you about your performance lately." Emma sat rigidly in the chair, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere over the first sergeant's shoulder. "Yes, First Sergeant. You've been here almost 2 months now," Williams continued, "and I've been watching you pretty carefully. Your work in the supply depot has been outstanding, And Captain Harper tells me you're one of the most organized soldiers she's ever worked with. But I'm concerned about what happened during the simulation. Emma's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she remained silent. Look, Rodriguez, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've seen all kinds of soldiers. Some are natural warriors who thrive in combat situations. Others are better suited for support roles where they can use their skills to help the team. In different ways. There's no shame in recognizing your strengths and limitations. The implication was clear, and Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. Are you recommending me for transfer, First Sergeant? Williams leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. I'm trying to figure out what's best for you and for the unit. The other soldiers have noticed your performance issues. It's affecting morale and unit cohesion. Some of them are starting to question whether they can count on you in a real combat situation. Emma's hands clenched into fists in her lap, but her voice remained steady. I understand, First Sergeant. The thing is, Williams continued, you're not the first soldier to struggle with combat stress. It's nothing to be ashamed of. The Army has excellent programs for soldiers who need help dealing with these issues. There are positions in the rear where you could make a real contribution without having to worry about combat situations. The offer was presented as kindness, but Emma heard it for what it was, a professional death sentence. Being transferred to a non-combat role would follow her for the rest of her military career, marking her as someone who couldn't be trusted when the situation got difficult. I appreciate the concern, First Sergeant, Emma said carefully, but I'd like to stay with the unit. I believe I can improve my performance with more training and experience. Williams sighed, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. Rodriguez, I've seen the reports from your simulation. Corporal Martinez said you were completely non-functional under pressure. That's not something that typically improves with more exposure to combat stress. Emma met his eyes for the first time during the conversation. Permission to speak freely, First Sergeant. Go ahead. I know my performance during the simulation was unsatisfactory. I know the other soldiers have concerns about my abilities. But I also know that I haven't been given a fair chance to prove myself. The simulation was my first exposure to that kind of scenario, and I was overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. With more training and preparation, I believe I can perform to standard. Williams studied her for a long moment, seeming to weigh her words against his own observations. What makes you think you can improve? What's different about you that would allow you to overcome what appears to be a fundamental problem with combat stress? Emma hesitated, knowing that her answer would sound strange to someone who approached combat from a purely practical perspective. I process information differently than other soldiers, First Sergeant. During the simulation, I wasn't frozen because I was afraid. I was trying to analyze the entire tactical situation simultaneously, and I got overwhelmed by the amount of data. I was processing. With practice, I believe I can learn to channel that analysis into effective action. Williams looked skeptical. That's an interesting theory, Rodriguez, but theories don't stop bullets. In a real combat situation, you need to be able to react instinctively, not stand there analyzing the tactical situation while your buddies are taking fire. I understand that, First Sergeant. But I also think that analytical thinking can be valuable in combat situations, especially in defensive scenarios where you have time to assess the situation and develop a comprehensive response. Williams was quiet for several moments, drumming his fingers on the desk while he considered her words. Finally, he leaned forward and fixed her with a hard stare. I'm going to give you one more chance, Rodriguez. We have another training exercise scheduled for next week, and I want to see significant improvement in your performance. If you can demonstrate that you can function effectively under pressure, I'll consider keeping you with the unit. But if you have another breakdown like the last one, I'm going to recommend you for immediate transfer to a non-combat role. Is that understood? Emma felt a surge of relief mixed with terror. She was being given another chance, But the stakes couldn't be higher. Yes, First Sergeant. I understand. Good. I'm going to assign you to work with Sergeant Walsh for additional combat training. He's going to put you through some intensive drills to help you develop your combat reflexes. I suggest you take advantage of this opportunity. Emma's heart sank at the mention of Walsh's name. The sergeant had made no secret of his disdain for her, and she knew that training with him would be more punishment than preparation. But she also knew that she had no choice. Thank you, First Sergeant. I won't let you down. As Emma left William's office, she felt the weight of the entire company's expectations pressing down on her. She had 1 week to prove that she belonged. In a combat unit, 1 week to overcome months of accumulated doubt and mockery. 1 week to transform herself from the mouse they thought she was into the soldier she knew she could become. The training with Sergeant Walsh began the next morning, and it was every bit as brutal as Emma had anticipated. Walsh had designed a series of combat drills that seemed specifically intended to break her down rather than build her up. He would scream commands at her while she tried to negotiate obstacle courses, set up scenarios where she had to make split-second decisions under extreme pressure, and constantly berate her performance in front of other soldiers. Faster, Rodriguez. He would shout as she struggled through close-quarters combat drills. The Taliban isn't going to wait for you to think about your next move. React. Fight. Do something besides stand there looking confused. Emma gritted her teeth and pushed through each exercise, her body aching from the physical demands and her mind reeling from the constant verbal assault. But something began to change during those grueling sessions. Instead of becoming more rattled by Walsh's abuse, she started to find a strange calm in the chaos. The analytical part of her mind began to work faster, processing the tactical situations. He created and developing responses that were both thoughtful and rapid. By the end of the week, Emma was performing the drills with a precision that surprised even Walsh. She was still quiet and methodical in her approach, but now that methodology was translating into effective action. Her movements were economical but decisive, her decision-making process rapid but thorough. The night before the second simulation exercise, Emma sat in her bunk with her journal open before her. Instead of writing about tactics or strategy, she found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had joined the army not because she wanted to be a warrior, but because she wanted to serve her country in a meaningful way. The mockery and isolation of the past month had nearly broken her spirit, but it had also forced her to confront fundamental questions about who she was and what she was capable of becoming. She thought about her family back in Texas, about the proud moment when she had graduated from basic training and the worried looks on her parents' faces when she told them about her deployment. She thought about the other soldiers in her unit, most of whom had dismissed her as weak or unsuitable for combat duties. And she thought about the mission they were all part of, the responsibility they shared to protect each other and accomplish their objectives in a hostile environment. As she closed the journal and prepared for sleep, Emma made a promise to herself. Tomorrow she would show them all what she was truly capable of. She would prove that courage came in many forms, that strength could be found in analysis as well as action, and that sometimes the quietest soldier could be the most dangerous when the situation demanded it. The base was quiet around her, with only the distant hum of generators and the occasional footstep of a guard making rounds. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the perimeter, real enemies were planning real attacks, and soon the simulations would give way to actual combat. When that moment came, Emma intended to be ready. She had spent her entire life being underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked. But tomorrow, she would begin to show them why that had been their mistake, not her weakness. The mouse was about to become something far more dangerous, and the soldiers who had mocked her were about to learn that the quiet ones were often the most dangerous of all. As sleep finally claimed her, Emma's last conscious thought was of the tactical possibilities that lay ahead, of the ways she might use her analytical mind to protect her fellow soldiers and complete their mission. She had been called weak, scared, and unsuitable for combat. Tomorrow she would begin to prove just how wrong they had been. The stakes were higher than anyone realized, and the test that was coming would reveal not just Emma's true capabilities, but the kind of soldier she had always been beneath the surface. The company thought they knew who she was, but they were about to discover that they had been judging the cover of a book whose true contents would shock them all. Emma Rodriguez was done hiding. Tomorrow, the real soldier would finally emerge. The second combat simulation arrived with the merciless heat of an Afghan summer morning. Emma Rodriguez stood at the eastern perimeter, her gear checked and rechecked, her mind focused on the tactical scenarios she had studied throughout the night. This time, she was paired with Corporal Lisa Thompson, a medic who had volunteered for the assignment after hearing about Emma's struggles. "Listen, Rodriguez," Thompson said as they settled into their defensive position. "I know what happened last time, but I also know you've been working your ass off this past week. Just do your job, and we'll get through this together." Emma nodded, grateful for the first words of genuine encouragement she had received in weeks. As the simulation began, she felt the familiar rush of sensory overload, but this time she was prepared. Instead of trying to process everything at once, she forced herself to focus on immediate threats while maintaining awareness of the broader tactical picture. The exercise unfolded with brutal efficiency. Enemy forces attacked from multiple directions, using coordinated tactics that tested the defender's ability to communicate and adapt under pressure. Emma found herself moving with a precision that surprised even her, calling out target positions, coordinating ammunition resupply, and maintaining effective fire on advancing threats. But it was during the final phase of the simulation that something extraordinary happened. As enemy forces concentrated their assault on the northern perimeter, Emma noticed a pattern in their movement that others had missed. The attack was a feint, designed to draw defenders away from the eastern approach where the real assault would come. "Thompson," Emma called out, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "They're setting up for a flanking maneuver. The main attack is coming from the east in approximately 3 minutes." Thompson looked skeptical. "How can you tell?" "The bulk of their forces are hitting the north wall." Emma's response was cut short by the sound of approaching vehicles. Exactly 3 minutes later, a convoy of simulated enemy forces appeared. On the eastern horizon, moving fast toward what they assumed would be a lightly defended section of the perimeter. Instead, they found Emma Rodriguez waiting for them. What followed was a textbook example of defensive warfare. Emma had positioned herself and Thompson to maximize their fields of fire while maintaining cover and concealment. She had calculated the optimal engagement range, identified the most effective target priorities, and developed contingency plans for multiple enemy approaches. The simulated battle lasted 47 minutes, and when it ended, Emma had accounted for 17 enemy casualties, while sustaining no losses in her sector. Her performance was flawless, but more importantly, her tactical insights had prevented what could have been a catastrophic breach of the base's defenses. The after-action review was conducted by Major Patricia Stone, the battalion's operations officer. As the assembled soldiers reviewed the simulation footage, Stone pointed to Emma's sector with undisguised admiration. Private Rodriguez demonstrated exceptional tactical awareness during this exercise, Stone announced. Her ability to predict enemy movements and position her forces accordingly was the deciding factor in our successful defense. This is the kind of analytical thinking that wins battles. The praise was unprecedented, but Emma felt no satisfaction from it. She had proven that she could perform under pressure, but she also knew that her fellow soldiers would find ways to minimize her achievement. Success was often more threatening to insecure people than failure. She was right. Within hours of the simulation's conclusion, the whispers began. Some soldiers claimed that Emma had been given advance knowledge of the enemy's plans. Others suggested that the exercise had been rigged to make her look good. Sergeant Walsh was the most vocal critic, arguing that Emma's performance was a fluke. That wouldn't translate to real combat situations. Anyone can look good when they know it's just a game, Walsh said during evening chow. But when real bullets start flying, when people are actually dying, that's when you see what someone's really made of. And I guarantee you that our little mouse will freeze up again the first time she hears incoming fire. The mockery took on a different character after the simulation, but it didn't stop. If anything, it became more subtle and therefore more insidious. Emma found herself excluded from planning sessions where her tactical insights might have been valuable. Her recommendations were dismissed or ignored, and her fellow soldiers treated her success as an anomaly rather than evidence of her capabilities. Captain Harper noticed the continued isolation and called Emma into her office the following week. The captain was a career logistics officer who had fought her own battles against military sexism and recognized the signs of a soldier being systematically undermined. "Rodriguez, I want to talk to you about your future in the Army," Harper began, settling behind her desk with a manila folder containing Emma's personnel file. "Your performance during the recent simulation was exemplary, but I'm concerned about your integration with the unit." Emma sat at attention, her face carefully neutral. "Yes, ma'am. I've been watching you for the past 2 months, and I see a soldier with exceptional analytical skills and tactical awareness. But I also see someone who's being isolated by her peers, and that concerns me from both a professional and personal standpoint." Harper opened the file and reviewed several pages before continuing. "I've received an inquiry from Division about talented soldiers who might be suitable for specialized training programs. There's a position opening in the intelligence corps. That would be perfect for someone with your particular skill set." Emma felt her stomach drop. Another transfer offer, another suggestion that she wasn't suited for combat duty. "Ma'am, I appreciate the consideration, but I'd prefer to remain with my current unit." "Rodriguez, I understand your desire to stay with the infantry, but I want you to consider the broader picture. The intelligence corps would allow you to use your analytical abilities in ways that could impact the entire theater of operations. You could be analyzing enemy patterns, developing tactical assessments, contributing to strategic planning." The offer was tempting, and Emma recognized that it was being presented as an opportunity rather than a punishment. But she also knew that accepting it would validate every criticism that had been leveled against her. She would be admitting that she couldn't handle the demands of combat duty. "Ma'am, I understand the value of intelligence work, but I believe I can make a greater contribution as an infantryman. My analytical skills are most effective when I'm in direct contact with tactical situations, not when I'm removed from them." Harper studied her carefully. "Rodriguez, can I ask you something personal? Why is it so important to you to stay in combat arms? You're clearly intelligent enough to excel in any number of specialized fields. Why put yourself through the stress and isolation of trying to prove yourself in an environment that seems determined to reject you?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, considering how much she should reveal. Finally, she decided that honesty was the only path forward. "Ma'am, I joined the Army because I wanted to serve my country in the most meaningful way possible. I believe that my skills and abilities are best utilized in situations where lives are at stake and decisions matter. I don't want to be shuffled off to a desk job where I can be safely ignored." Harper nodded slowly. "I respect that, Rodriguez. But I also want you to understand that you're fighting an uphill battle. The Army is changing, but it's still a predominantly male institution with deeply ingrained attitudes about women in combat roles. You're not just trying to prove yourself as a soldier. You're trying to overcome decades of institutional bias. I understand that, ma'am. But I also believe that the only way to change those attitudes is to demonstrate that they're wrong. Running away to a safer assignment would just reinforce the stereotypes that I'm trying to overcome." Harper closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "All right, Rodriguez. I'll support your decision to stay with the unit. But I want you to understand that this is going to be a difficult path, and you're going to face challenges that have nothing to do with your military capabilities." Emma felt a surge of gratitude mixed with apprehension. "Thank you, ma'am. I won't let you down." As Emma left Harper's office, she felt the weight of the decision she had made. She was choosing to remain in a hostile environment where her every action would be scrutinized and criticized. But she also knew that it was the only choice she could make and still respect herself. The weeks that followed brought a new kind of challenge. Emma's exceptional performance during the simulation had earned her a grudging respect from some soldiers, but it had also made her a target for those who felt threatened by her abilities. The mockery became more sophisticated, designed to undermine her confidence rather than simply humiliate her. During weapons training, Sergeant Walsh would assign Emma to work with the newest and most incompetent soldiers, ensuring that she was associated with poor performance. In tactical exercises, she would be given assignments that were either impossibly difficult or strategically irrelevant, setting her up for failure or marginalization. The psychological warfare was exhausting, but Emma refused to let it break her. She threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, studying enemy tactics, analyzing intelligence reports, and developing innovative approaches to common military problems. Her personal notebooks became filled with detailed assessments of local terrain, enemy capabilities, and potential defensive strategies. It was during this period that Emma began to uncover information that would change everything. While reviewing intelligence reports in her capacity as a logistics specialist, she noticed patterns in enemy activity that others had missed. Small details about supply movements, communication intercepts, and reconnaissance activities that seemed unrelated when viewed individually, but formed a coherent picture when analyzed together. Emma spent weeks compiling and cross-referencing data, working late into the night to piece together what she believed was evidence of a major enemy operation in the planning stages. The intelligence suggested that insurgent forces were positioning themselves for a coordinated assault on Forward Operating Base Sentinel, using tactics and resources that would overwhelm the base's current defensive preparations. The problem was that Emma's analysis contradicted the official intelligence assessments provided by higher headquarters. According to the formal reports, enemy activity in the region was decreasing, and the threat level to the base was considered minimal. Emma's conclusion suggested the opposite, that the apparent decrease in activity was actually evidence of careful preparation for a major attack. She faced a dilemma that would define her military career. She could present her analysis to the command structure, risking ridicule and potentially career-ending consequences if she was wrong. Or she could remain silent, avoiding personal risk but potentially allowing her fellow soldiers to be caught unprepared for a devastating attack. Emma chose to act on her convictions. She prepared a comprehensive intelligence assessment, complete with detailed analysis, supporting evidence, and tactical recommendations. The document was 37 pages long and represented weeks of meticulous research and analysis. She submitted it through proper channels, requesting a meeting with the battalion intelligence officer to present her findings. The response was swift and dismissive. Major David Reynolds, the battalion's intelligence officer, called Emma into his office the day after receiving her report. Reynolds was a career intelligence specialist who had little patience for what he considered amateur analysis from support personnel. "Rodriguez, I've reviewed your assessment," Reynolds began, tapping the printed document with obvious disdain. "I have to say, I'm impressed by the effort you put into this, but I'm concerned that you're overstepping your role as a logistics specialist." Emma sat rigidly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. "Sir, I believe the intelligence indicates a significant threat to the base's security. I felt it was my duty to report my findings." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, studying Emma with a mixture of amusement and irritation. Rodriguez, intelligence analysis is a specialized field that requires years of training and experience. You're a supply clerk who's been in the Army for less than 2 years. What makes you think you're qualified to interpret complex intelligence? Data. Sir, I understand that I'm not a trained intelligence analyst, but I have access to logistics data that provides a unique perspective on enemy activities. The patterns I've identified are based on supply movements, resource requirements, and operational timelines that might not be apparent from traditional intelligence sources. Reynolds picked up the report and flipped through several pages. Let me explain something to you, Rodriguez. We have professional intelligence analysts at division level who review all available data before making threat assessments. These are people with advanced degrees, years of experience, and access to classified information that you can't even imagine. Do you really think you've discovered something that they've missed? Emma felt her confidence wavering under Reynolds' condescending tone, but she forced herself to maintain her position. Sir, I'm not claiming to have discovered anything that others couldn't find. I'm simply presenting an alternative interpretation of available data. I believe it's worth considering, especially given the potential consequences if the threat is real. Reynolds set the report down and fixed Emma with a hard stare. Rodriguez, I'm going to be very clear with you. This kind of amateur analysis is not only useless, it's potentially dangerous. When unqualified personnel start making dire predictions based on incomplete information, it can create unnecessary panic and divert resources from legitimate threats. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with Reynolds systematically dismantling Emma's analysis and questioning her qualifications to make intelligence assessments. By the end of the session, Emma felt intellectually battered and professionally humiliated. Rodriguez, I'm going to file this report in the appropriate location, Reynolds said as the meeting concluded, gesturing toward a wastebasket beside his desk. I suggest you focus on your logistics duties and leave intelligence analysis to the professionals. Is that understood? Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. Yes, sir. Understood. As she left Reynolds' office, Emma felt the crushing weight of institutional dismissal. She had identified what she believed to be a credible threat to the lives of her fellow soldiers, and her warnings had been not just ignored, but ridiculed. The system that was supposed to protect them had failed to take her seriously because she was the wrong rank, the wrong gender, and the wrong kind of soldier. That night, Emma sat in her bunk with her intelligence assessment spread across her lap. The document represented weeks of careful analysis and represented her best effort to serve her country and protect her fellow soldiers. But it had been dismissed as the amateur work of an unqualified clerk. She thought about the patterns she had identified, the evidence she had compiled, and the logical conclusions she had drawn. She had triple-checked her work, verified her sources, and tested her assumptions. She remained convinced that her analysis was correct, and that the base was facing a significant threat. Emma faced a choice that would define not just her military career, but her entire sense of self. She could accept the judgment of her superiors and remain silent, avoiding further professional damage but potentially allowing a disaster to unfold. Or she could continue to push her concerns up the chain of command, risking her career and reputation but potentially saving lives. As she considered her options, Emma realized that the decision had already been made. She had not joined the Army to advance her career or to earn the approval of her superiors. She had joined to serve her country and protect her fellow soldiers, and that mission remained unchanged regardless of how her warnings were received. The next morning, Emma began preparing a new version of her intelligence assessment. This time, she would present it directly to the base commander, bypassing the normal chain of command and accepting the career consequences that would inevitably follow. She had been called a coward and a failure, but she would not be called someone who remained silent when lives were at stake. Emma Rodriguez was about to discover that sometimes the most courageous act is not following orders, but following your conscience. The quiet logistics specialist who had been dismissed and marginalized was about to force the entire command structure to confront the possibility that they had been wrong about both the threat they faced and the soldier they had underestimated. The storm that was coming would test not just Emma's analytical abilities, but her courage, her convictions, and her willingness to sacrifice everything for the safety of her fellow soldiers. The woman they had called Frozen was about to prove that sometimes the greatest warriors are those who refuse to remain silent when silence could mean death. In the desert darkness beyond the base perimeter, enemy forces were indeed moving into position, following exactly the pattern that Emma had predicted. The attack would come soon, and when it did, the soldiers who had mocked her would discover that their lives depended on the very woman they had dismissed as weak and unsuitable for combat. Emma had tried to warn them through official channels, but the system had failed. Now she would have to find another way to protect them, even if it meant destroying her own career in the process. The mouse was about to become something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined, and the cost of underestimating her was about to become tragically clear. The revelation of who Emma Rodriguez truly was would come not through medals or commendations, but through the brutal test of actual combat. When the shooting started, when lives hung in the balance, when courage was measured not in words but in actions, the quiet logistics specialist would finally have her chance to prove that she had been right all along. The greatest battles are often fought not against external enemies, but against the institutional forces that seek to silence those who see the truth. Emma Rodriguez was about to fight both kinds of battles simultaneously, and the outcome would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of every soldier who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or told that they didn't belong. The real war was just beginning, and Emma Rodriguez was ready to fight it on her own terms, with her own weapons and by her own rules. The system had failed her, but she would not fail the system. Even if it meant standing alone against the darkness that was coming, she would stand and she would fight, and she would prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in any army is a soldier who refuses to give up. The weeks following Emma's rejected intelligence assessment brought a new level of professional persecution that went far beyond the casual mockery she had endured before. Word of her amateur intelligence analysis had spread throughout the base, transforming her from a figure of mild ridicule into someone actively viewed as a troublemaker who didn't understand her place in the military hierarchy. Sergeant Walsh took particular pleasure in Emma's latest humiliation. During the morning formation, he would make pointed comments about soldiers who thought they were smarter than their superiors, about the importance of staying in one's lane, and about the dangers of allowing ambition to cloud judgment. His eyes would find Emma in the formation as he spoke, making sure everyone understood who his remarks were targeting. Some people think that reading a few manuals makes them experts, Walsh announced one sweltering Tuesday morning. They forget that there's a reason we have ranks, a reason we have specialists, and a reason why some people are given authority while others are expected to follow orders. When that system breaks down, people die. The other soldiers absorbed these lessons with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some seemed genuinely convinced that Emma had overstepped her bounds and represented a threat to unit cohesion. Others appeared uncomfortable with the systematic targeting of a fellow soldier, but lacked the courage to speak up in her defense. Emma endured these public humiliations with the same stoic silence she had maintained throughout her deployment. She stood at attention during formations, performed her duties with meticulous precision, and gave no outward sign that the constant psychological pressure was affecting her. But privately, she felt the weight of isolation growing heavier with each passing day. The harassment extended beyond verbal abuse into more subtle forms of professional sabotage. Emma found herself assigned to the most undesirable duty shifts. often working alone in the supply depot during hours when the rest of the base was asleep. Her requests for equipment and supplies were delayed or denied without explanation. Reports she submitted were returned with minor corrections that required her to rewrite entire documents. Captain Harper tried to shield Emma from the worst of the retaliation, but her ability to intervene was limited by the informal networks of influence that governed military life. During one particularly frustrating week, Harper called Emma into her office to discuss the deteriorating situation. "Rodriguez, I want you to know that I'm aware of what's happening to you," Harper began, her voice heavy with frustration. "The treatment you're receiving is unprofessional and counterproductive. But I also want you to understand that my ability to protect you is limited." Emma sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for Harper to continue. "I've spoken to First Sergeant Williams about the situation, and he's agreed to have a word with Sergeant Walsh about toning down the rhetoric. But the reality is that you've made some powerful enemies by challenging the intelligence assessment, and they're not going to forget that anytime soon." Harper paused, studying Emma's face for any sign of emotion. "I have to ask you again. Are you sure you don't want to reconsider that intelligence corps position? The offer is still open, and it would get you out of this hostile environment." Emma met Harper's eyes with quiet determination. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I still believe that my analysis was correct. The threat to this base is real, and transferring me to another unit won't make it go away." Harper sighed, clearly torn between her desire to protect Emma and her frustration with the situation. "Rodriguez, even if your analysis was correct, which I'm not qualified to judge, the fact remains that you presented it inappropriately. There are protocols for intelligence sharing, and you violated those protocols by going outside your area of expertise. Ma'am, I understand that I may have violated protocol, but I felt that the potential threat to the base justified the risk. If I had remained silent and something had happened to our soldiers, I would never have been able to live with myself." Harper leaned back in her chair, studying Emma with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Rodriguez, your dedication to your fellow soldiers is admirable, but you need to understand that the military operates on trust and hierarchy. When you circumvent that system, you undermine the very foundation of military order." Emma was quiet for a long moment, considering Harper's words. Finally, she spoke with careful precision. "Ma'am, I understand the importance of military hierarchy, but I also believe that hierarchy should serve the mission, not the other way around. When the system prevents critical information from reaching decision makers, then the system has failed." Harper's expression softened slightly. "Rodriguez, I can see that you're struggling with this situation, and I respect your convictions. But I also want you to understand that you're fighting a battle you can't win. The military establishment is not going to change its fundamental operating principles because one junior enlisted soldier thinks she knows better." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Harper trying to convince Emma to accept the intelligence corps' transfer and Emma politely but firmly declining. By the end of the meeting, both women understood that Emma was choosing to remain in a situation that would likely destroy her military career. As Emma left Harper's office, she felt the full weight of her decision. She was choosing principle over pragmatism, conviction over career advancement, and truth over institutional harmony. The path ahead would be difficult, but she had made her choice with full knowledge of the consequences. The harassment intensified over the following days. Emma's personal items began disappearing from her footlocker, only to reappear in inappropriate locations around the base. Her work assignments became increasingly menial and degrading. She was excluded from briefings and training sessions that should have been part of her normal duties. The psychological pressure reached a breaking point during a particularly brutal week in late summer. Emma had been assigned to a series of overnight shifts in the supply depot, working alone while the rest of the base slept. The isolation was complete, and the silence was broken only by the distant hum of generators and the occasional footstep of perimeter guards. It was during one of these lonely vigils that Emma made a discovery that would change everything. While conducting a routine inventory of ammunition supplies, she noticed discrepancies in the consumption reports that hadn't been apparent during normal working hours. Certain types of ammunition were being used at rates that didn't match the recorded training exercises and patrol activities. Emma's analytical mind immediately began processing the implications. Either the base was conducting unreported combat operations, or ammunition was being diverted for purposes that weren't being documented through official channels. Neither possibility was particularly reassuring. She began a systematic investigation, working during her off-duty hours to trace the movement of supplies and compare consumption rates with official activity reports. What she discovered was a pattern of resource allocation that suggested the base was preparing for a major defensive operation, even though no such operation had been announced through official channels. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Emergency medical supplies were being stockpiled at levels far exceeding normal requirements. Ammunition reserves were being redistributed to defensive positions around the base perimeter. Communications equipment was being tested and repositioned with unusual frequency. Emma realized that someone in the command structure was taking her intelligence assessment seriously, even if they couldn't publicly acknowledge it. The base was quietly preparing for the attack she had predicted, while officially maintaining that no such threat existed. The discovery was both vindicating and terrifying. Emma had been right about the threat, but she had also learned that the military's response to that threat was being conducted in secret, without informing the very soldiers whose lives would be at risk when the attack came. She faced another impossible choice. She could remain silent about her discovery, allowing the secret preparations to continue while her fellow soldiers remained unaware of the danger they faced. Or she could try to warn them, risking accusations of spreading panic and potentially compromising whatever defensive plans were being implemented. Emma chose a middle path that would define her character for the rest of her military career. She began quietly sharing tactical information with individual soldiers, disguising her warnings as general advice about defensive procedures and combat preparedness. She couldn't tell them about the specific threat she had identified, but she could help them prepare for the dangers they would soon face. The process was slow and delicate. Emma had to be careful not to reveal her sources or raise suspicions about her motives. She would approach soldiers during off-duty hours, offering to help them improve their marksmanship or suggesting modifications to their defensive positions. She shared tactical insights disguised as theoretical discussions about combat effectiveness. Some soldiers responded positively to Emma's unofficial mentoring, appreciating her analytical approach to military problems. Others were suspicious of her motives, wondering why the base's most ridiculed soldier was suddenly offering unsolicited advice about combat tactics. Corporal Lisa Thompson was one of the soldiers who took Emma's advice seriously. During a conversation in the base dining facility, Emma had suggested that Thompson review her medical supplies and consider positioning additional first aid equipment at strategic locations around the base. Why the sudden interest in medical preparedness? Thompson asked, studying Emma's face carefully. Emma chose her words carefully. I've been thinking about the tactical challenges we might face in different scenarios. It seems like having medical supplies distributed throughout the base would improve our response time in emergency situations. Thompson nodded slowly. That makes sense. Have you discussed this with Captain Harper or the medical officer? I've shared some of my thoughts with Captain Harper, but I wanted to get your perspective as someone with medical training. Do you think the current distribution of medical supplies is adequate for a major emergency? Thompson considered the question seriously. Actually, now that you mention it, I've been concerned about our medical response capabilities. We have excellent facilities in the aid station, but if we had casualties in multiple locations simultaneously, we might have trouble providing adequate care. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Emma subtly guiding Thompson toward the conclusion that additional medical preparation would be prudent. By the end of their discussion, Thompson had agreed to quietly position additional medical supplies at key locations around the base. Emma had similar conversations with other soldiers, each tailored to their specific roles and responsibilities. She helped improve defensive positions, suggested modifications to communication procedures, and provided tactical insights that would prove invaluable when the attack finally came. The process was exhausting and emotionally draining. Emma was essentially conducting a shadow campaign to prepare the base for an attack that officially didn't exist, while maintaining the pretense that she was simply an overeager logistics specialist with an interest in tactical theory. The strain of leading this double life began to show in Emma's physical appearance and emotional state. She lost weight from the stress and lack of sleep. Her eyes took on a haunted quality that suggested she was carrying knowledge too heavy for one person to bear alone. Her few remaining friends at the base began to worry about her mental health. Specialist Janet Chun, who had worked with Emma in the supply depot, noticed the changes in her colleagues' behavior. "Rodriguez, are you okay? You seem like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Emma forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Chun. Just trying to stay busy and improve my tactical knowledge." Chun studied Emma's face carefully. "Look, I know you've been getting a lot of grief from some of the other soldiers, but you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You're a good soldier, and the people who matter know that." The kindness in Chun's voice nearly broke Emma's composure. She had been isolated for so long that genuine concern felt almost foreign. "Thank you, Chun. I appreciate that. Is there anything I can do to help? I know things have been difficult since that incident with the intelligence report." Emma considered telling Chun about her discoveries, about the secret preparations and the impending attack. But she also knew that sharing that information would put Chun at risk and potentially compromise the base's defensive preparations. "I'm managing okay," Emma said finally. "But I appreciate the offer." Chun nodded, clearly sensing that Emma wasn't telling her everything, but respecting her privacy. "Well, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. We support personnel have to stick together." As Chun walked away, Emma felt the crushing weight of her isolation more acutely than ever. She was surrounded by people whose lives she was trying to protect, but she couldn't share her burden with any of them. The knowledge of the impending attack was hers alone to carry, and the responsibility was becoming almost unbearable. That night, Emma sat in her bunk with her personal journal open before her. For the first time since her deployment began, she wrote not about tactical analysis or military procedures, but about her emotional state and the impossible situation she found herself in. "I know something terrible is coming," she wrote. "I can see it in the patterns, feel it in the preparation that's happening around me. But I can't share this knowledge with the people who need it most. I'm trying to prepare them in small ways, but it feels like trying to stop a hurricane with an umbrella." She paused, staring at the words she had written. "I joined the army to serve my country and protect my fellow soldiers. But I never imagined that service would require me to carry such a heavy burden alone. I pray that I'm wrong about what's coming, but I know that I'm not. The only question is whether I'll be strong enough to do what needs to be done when the time comes." Emma closed the journal and lay back on her bunk, staring at the ceiling of the barracks. Around her, other soldiers slept peacefully, unaware of the danger that was approaching. She envied their ignorance, their ability to rest without the weight of terrible knowledge pressing down on them. But she also knew that her burden was part of her purpose. Someone had to see the patterns, someone had to prepare for the worst, and someone had to be ready to act when the moment came. Emma Rodriguez had been chosen for this role not by her superiors or her training, but by her own analytical mind and her unwavering commitment to protecting her fellow soldiers. The attack would come soon, and when it did, Emma would be ready. She had spent months preparing not just herself, but the entire base for the battle that was coming. The soldiers who had mocked her would discover that their lives depended on the very woman they had dismissed as weak and unsuitable for combat. Emma had tried to warn them through official channels, but the system had failed. She had tried to prepare them through unofficial means, and that effort was ongoing. But ultimately, she knew that when the shooting started, when lives hung in the balance, when courage was measured not in words, but in actions, she would have to stand alone against the darkness that was coming. The mouse was about to become something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined, and the cost of underestimating her was about to become tragically clear. Emma Rodriguez was ready to fight the battle of her life, not for recognition or vindication, but for the simple and profound purpose of keeping her fellow soldiers alive. The greatest test was coming, and Emma would meet it with everything she had learned, everything she had prepared, and everything she believed about duty, honor, and the true meaning of courage. The quiet logistics specialist was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in any army is a soldier who refuses to give up, no matter what the cost. The attack came at 0347 hours on a moonless Thursday morning, exactly as Emma Rodriguez had predicted it would. The first indication was the distant rumble of mortar being fired from positions in the surrounding hills. Emma was already awake, had been awake for hours, sitting in the supply depot with her gear ready and her mind focused on the tactical situation she knew was about to unfold. When the incoming rounds began to impact around the base perimeter, she was the only soldier who wasn't surprised. The mortar barrage was precisely coordinated, targeting the base's communication arrays, vehicle maintenance areas, and primary defensive positions. But Emma had anticipated this strategy and had quietly encouraged key personnel to relocate critical equipment and establish backup communication systems in secondary locations. As sirens wailed across the base and soldiers stumbled from their bunks in confusion, Emma moved with the calm precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. She grabbed her rifle and the tactical bag she had packed weeks earlier, then made her way toward the eastern perimeter where she knew the main assault would come. The base erupted into controlled chaos as soldiers raced to their defensive positions. In the command bunker, officers shouted orders and tried to establish communication with higher headquarters. The carefully rehearsed emergency procedures that had seemed adequate during training suddenly felt woefully inadequate in the face of a real coordinated attack. Emma reached the eastern wall just as the first wave of enemy fighters emerged from the pre-dawn darkness. There were more of them than the intelligence estimates had suggested, and they were better equipped and more organized than anyone had expected. They moved with the tactical sophistication of professional soldiers, rather than the improvised tactics typically associated with insurgent forces. The defensive position Emma had chosen was one she had studied and improved over the previous weeks. She had reinforced the sandbag walls, established multiple firing positions, and stockpiled ammunition and medical supplies. Most importantly, she had calculated precise fields of fire and identified the optimal engagement ranges for different types of targets. As the enemy forces advanced across the open ground toward the base, Emma began to engage them with methodical precision. Each shot was carefully aimed, each target deliberately selected for maximum tactical impact. She wasn't just shooting at individual enemies. She was disrupting their tactical formations, eliminating key leaders, and forcing them to alter their approach in ways that would make them vulnerable to other defensive positions. The battle that followed would be remembered as one of the most intense combat actions in the history of Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Enemy forces attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, using tactics that suggested extensive reconnaissance and planning. They employed mortar, rocket-propelled grenades, and small arms fire in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the base's defensive capabilities. But Emma Rodriguez had seen this attack coming, and she had prepared for it in ways that no one else could have imagined. From her position on the eastern wall, Emma became the focal point of the base's defense. Her analytical mind processed the battlefield with computer-like efficiency, tracking the movement of dozens of enemy fighters and calculating the optimal responses to their tactical maneuvers. She called out target priorities to other defenders, coordinated ammunition resupply, and provided tactical guidance that turned what should have been a catastrophic surprise attack into a manageable defensive action. For 6 hours, Emma Rodriguez held the eastern approach against overwhelming odds. She fired over 400 rounds, eliminated 17 confirmed enemy targets, and prevented a breach that would have allowed hostile forces to overrun the entire base. Her position became an anchor point around which the entire defense was organized. During the third hour of the battle, when ammunition was running low and several defensive positions had been damaged by enemy fire, Emma made a decision that would define her legacy. She left the relative safety of her fortified position and moved across open ground under heavy fire to resupply other defenders and coordinate their response. Sergeant Walsh, who had spent months mocking Emma's supposed cowardice, found himself in a damaged bunker with 2 wounded soldiers and no ammunition. When Emma appeared beside him with fresh supplies and medical equipment, his expression showed a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Rodriguez," Walsh gasped, blood running from a shrapnel wound on his forehead. "How did you know we needed help?" Emma was already working to treat the wounded soldiers while simultaneously scanning the battlefield for threats. "I've been tracking enemy movement patterns since the attack began," she said calmly. "Your position was receiving concentrated fire, and I calculated that you would need resupply within the next 15 minutes. Walsh stared at her in amazement. "You've been tracking the entire battlefield while fighting your own engagement?" Emma handed Walsh fresh ammunition magazines and positioned herself to provide covering fire for his position. "The battlefield is a system, Sergeant. Once you understand the patterns, you can predict the requirements." For the next hour, Emma moved between defensive positions like a battlefield conductor, orchestrating the base's response with tactical genius that surprised even the most experienced soldiers. She seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they happened, appeared at critical locations exactly when she was needed most, and provided leadership that transformed a desperate defense into a tactical masterpiece. Colonel James Harrison, the base commander, watched Emma's performance from the command bunker with growing amazement. Harrison was a career infantry officer with 3 combat deployments and 22 years of military experience. He had never seen a single soldier have such a decisive impact on a major engagement. "Who is that soldier?" Harrison asked First Sergeant Williams, pointing to Emma on the battlefield display. Williams checked his roster with obvious discomfort. "That's Private First Class Rodriguez, sir. She's assigned to the supply depot." Harrison studied the tactical display more carefully, watching as Emma coordinated the defense of multiple positions while maintaining her own effective fire. "A supply clerk is running our defense. Sir, Rodriguez has had some issues with unit integration. She submitted an intelligence assessment several weeks ago that was rejected by the battalion intelligence officer. There were concerns about her qualifications and judgment." Harrison's expression darkened as he began to understand the implications. What was the subject of her intelligence assessment? Williams hesitated before answering. "She predicted a coordinated attack on the base, sir. Her analysis suggested that enemy forces were positioning themselves for exactly the kind of assault we're experiencing now." The command bunker fell silent as the full weight of Williams' words settled over the assembled officers. Emma Rodriguez had not only predicted the attack they were currently experiencing, but she had apparently spent weeks preparing for it, while being dismissed and ridiculed by the very people whose lives she was now saving. Colonel Harrison grabbed the radio and tried to establish direct communication with Emma's position. When she responded, her voice was calm and professional despite the chaos of battle raging around her. "Rodriguez, this is Colonel Harrison. I need a tactical assessment of our current situation." Emma's response was immediate and comprehensive. "Sir, enemy forces are conducting a coordinated assault using approximately 60 fighters in 3 main groups. They have limited heavy weapons, but excellent tactical coordination. The eastern approach remains the primary threat, but they're preparing a secondary assault from the north that should begin in approximately 20 minutes. Harrison exchanged glances with his staff officers. Emma's assessment matched their own intelligence picture perfectly, but she was providing details and predictions that their formal analysis had missed. "Rodriguez, what's your recommendation for our defensive posture?" "Sir, I recommend repositioning the reserve squad to reinforce the northern perimeter and requesting immediate air support for the enemy staging area approximately 1 kilometer east of our position. If we can disrupt their command and control element, the assault will lose coordination within 30 minutes. Harrison immediately ordered the tactical changes Emma had suggested. Within minutes, air support was en route to the target she had identified, and the reserve squad was moving to reinforce the northern defenses exactly as she had recommended. The battle continued for 3 more hours, but Emma's tactical guidance had fundamentally altered its trajectory. The enemy assault, which should have overwhelmed the base's defenses, was systematically dismantled by a defense that anticipated every move and countered every tactic. When the firing finally stopped and the enemy forces withdrew into the surrounding hills, Forward Operating Base Sentinel had achieved what military historians would later describe as an impossible victory. Despite being outnumbered and surprised, the base had suffered only minor casualties while inflicting devastating losses on the attacking force. As dawn broke over the battlefield, the full scope of Emma's contribution became clear to everyone who had witnessed her performance. She had not only fought with exceptional courage and skill, but she had provided the tactical leadership that had saved the base and the lives of everyone in it. Colonel Harrison found Emma at her position on the eastern wall, methodically cleaning her rifle while surveying the battlefield for any remaining threats. Her uniform was torn and stained with dust and sweat, but her expression remained calm and focused. "Rodriguez," Harrison said as he approached, "I owe you an apology, and so does every person on this base." Emma looked up from her rifle, her expression unchanged. "Sir, I was just doing my job." Harrison shook his head in amazement. "No, Rodriguez, what you did today went far beyond your job description. You single-handedly organized our defense, predicted enemy movements, and provided tactical leadership that saved hundreds of lives. I've never seen anything like it in 22 years of military service." Other soldiers began to gather around Emma's position as word of her performance spread throughout the base. These were the same people who had mocked her, dismissed her, and treated her as an outcast. Now they looked at her with expressions of awe, gratitude, and shame. Sergeant Walsh approached Emma with obvious difficulty, his earlier wounds bandaged but his pride clearly damaged. "Rodriguez, I owe you my life. If you hadn't brought us ammunition and medical supplies when you did, my entire squad would have been overrun." Emma met his eyes without hostility or satisfaction. "We're all on the same team, Sergeant. I'm glad I could help." The simple dignity of her response only deepened the shame that Walsh and others felt about their treatment of her. They had judged her based on their own limited understanding of courage and capability, and they had been catastrophically wrong. Colonel Harrison made a decision that would reshape Emma's military career. "Rodriguez, I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to sergeant and assignment as the base's senior tactical analyst. I'm also recommending you for the Bronze Star with Valor for your actions during today's engagement." Emma was quiet for a moment, considering the colonel's offer. When she finally spoke, her words surprised everyone who heard them. "Sir, I appreciate the recognition, but I'd prefer to remain in my current position. The supply depot is where I can make the most effective contribution to the base's mission." Harrison stared at her in disbelief. "Rodriguez, you just proved that you're one of the most tactically gifted soldiers I've ever encountered. Why would you want to stay in a logistics position?" Emma's answer revealed the depth of her character and the true nature of her service. "Sir, yesterday I was just another soldier doing her job. Today I'm being offered recognition and promotion because I happened to be right about something that others were wrong about. But tomorrow there will be other challenges, other threats, and other soldiers who see things that others miss. I don't want special treatment or recognition. I just want to serve my country and protect my fellow soldiers in whatever capacity allows me to be most effective." The assembled soldiers listened to Emma's words with growing admiration. She was rejecting everything that most of them would have desperately wanted: promotion, recognition, and vindication after months of humiliation. Instead, she was choosing to return to the quiet service that had always defined her. Colonel Harrison nodded slowly, beginning to understand the kind of person he was dealing with. "Rodriguez, your request is noted and approved. But I want you to know that your tactical insights will be welcome in any situation where they might be helpful." Emma smiled for the first time since her deployment began. "Thank you, sir. I'll always be available if you need me." As the officers and soldiers dispersed to begin the cleanup and recovery process, Emma returned to her work in the supply depot. But everything had changed, even if she remained in the same position. The other soldiers now treated her with respect that bordered on reverence. Her tactical recommendations were sought and valued. Her quiet competence was recognized as the extraordinary gift it had always been. 3 weeks later, Emma received a letter from home that brought tears to her eyes. Her younger sister Maria had enlisted in the army and specifically requested assignment to a combat unit. The letter included a newspaper clipping about the battle at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, with Emma's photograph and a quote about the importance of analytical thinking in modern warfare. "I want to serve like my sister," Maria had written. "She showed me that courage comes in many forms, and that the quiet ones are often the strongest of all." Emma carefully folded the letter and placed it in her personal belongings. She had joined the army to serve her country and protect her fellow soldiers, and she had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations. But more importantly, she had shown that true strength wasn't about being the loudest or the most aggressive. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was to remain quietly competent, analytically brilliant, and utterly dedicated to the mission and the people who depended on them. The woman they had Khalid scared frozen had held the line for 6 hours against overwhelming odds, not because she was fearless, but because she understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. Courage was the decision to act effectively, despite fear, to think clearly under pressure, and to put the welfare of others above personal comfort or recognition. Emma Rodriguez had proven that the greatest warriors are often those who never seek glory, but who simply do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. In a world that often celebrated flash over substance, she had shown that quiet competence and analytical brilliance could be the most powerful weapons of all. 6 months after the battle that changed everything, Emma Rodriguez stood in the same supply depot where her journey had begun. But the world around her had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The morning inventory that had once been a solitary ritual now included other soldiers who sought her guidance on tactical logistics, resource management, and the analytical thinking that had saved their lives. Private Jessica Torres, a young soldier who had arrived at the base just weeks after the attack, watched Emma work with the reverence typically reserved for legendary figures. Torres had heard the stories, seen the after-action reports, and studied the tactical analysis that had become required reading for new arrivals at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Torres said, using the rank that Emma had finally accepted after Colonel Harrison, made it clear that refusing promotion was itself becoming a distraction from her mission. "Could you help me understand how you calculate ammunition requirements for extended defensive operations?" Emma looked up from her clipboard with the patient expression she had developed for mentoring younger soldiers. "The key is understanding consumption patterns under different stress levels," she explained, moving to a whiteboard where she had drawn tactical diagrams. "Most soldiers fire 3 times as many rounds during actual combat as they do during training exercises, but the variation depends on their experience level, the intensity of the engagement, and their position in the defensive. Structure." Torres took notes with the dedication of a graduate student, recognizing that she was receiving insights that couldn't be found in any manual. Emma had become something unprecedented in military culture, a junior NCO whose tactical wisdom was sought by officers with decades more experience. The transformation wasn't limited to Emma's professional status. The base itself had evolved in response to the lessons learned during the attack. New defensive positions incorporated Emma's analytical approach to fields of fire and tactical geometry. Communication protocols reflected her insights about information flow during crisis situations. Supply distribution followed patterns she had developed to ensure rapid response capability across multiple scenarios. More importantly, the culture of the unit had changed. The casual dismissal of unconventional thinking that had characterized Emma's early months at the base had been replaced by an environment that actively sought diverse perspectives and analytical approaches to military problems. Captain Harper, who had been promoted to major and assigned as the base's new executive officer, often used Emma's story as an example when training new officers. "The most dangerous assumption you can make," Harper would tell junior leaders, "is that you understand everything about a situation based on surface appearances." Private Rodriguez appeared to be a quiet logistics specialist who couldn't handle combat stress. In reality, she was processing more tactical information than any of us and developing solutions to problems we didn't even know we had. The lesson had implications far beyond Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Emma's tactical analysis in combat performance had been studied at military schools throughout the country, becoming a case study in the importance of analytical thinking and the dangers of institutional bias. Colonel Harrison, who had witnessed Emma's transformation from dismissed outcast to tactical genius, found himself reassessing fundamental assumptions about leadership and capability. During a staff meeting focused on personnel development, he shared insights that had taken him decades to understand. "We have a tendency in the military to promote and recognize people who fit our preconceived notions of what a leader should look like," Harrison told his assembled officers. "We favor the loud over the thoughtful, the aggressive over the analytical, the confident over the competent." Sergeant Rodriguez has shown us that sometimes the most valuable soldiers are the ones who process information differently, who see patterns that others miss, and who approach problems from unexpected angles. The impact of Emma's example extended beyond the immediate unit. Young women throughout the military began to see new possibilities for their own service, understanding that excellence could take many forms and that analytical brilliance was as valuable as physical courage in modern warfare. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a recent West Point graduate assigned to a different base in Afghanistan, carried a printed copy of Emma's tactical analysis in her field manual. Chun had never met Emma, but she drew inspiration from the story of a soldier who had persevered through institutional dismissal to prove that competence trumped prejudice. "What Emma Rodriguez did," Chun wrote in a letter to her mentor at West Point, "was demonstrate that the military's definition of courage was too narrow. She showed that thinking clearly under pressure, preparing methodically for threats that others don't see, and standing up for your convictions despite social pressure are all forms of courage that are just as important as physical bravery." The broader implications of Emma's story weren't lost on military researchers and policymakers. Dr. Amanda Foster, a behavioral scientist at the Army War College, used Emma's case as the foundation for a comprehensive study of analytical thinking in combat situations. The Rodriguez case represents a paradigm shift in how we understand battlefield intelligence and tactical decision-making, Foster wrote in her published research. Traditional military culture has emphasized rapid, instinctive responses to tactical situations. But modern warfare requires the ability to process complex information, identify subtle patterns, and develop comprehensive solutions to multifaceted problems. Soldiers like Sergeant Rodriguez represent the future of military thinking. Emma herself remained largely unaware of her growing influence on military culture and doctrine. She continued to focus on her daily responsibilities, approaching each task with the same methodical precision that had characterized her service from the beginning. But she did notice changes in how younger soldiers approached their own development. Private Marcus Johnson, who had been inspired by Emma's example to pursue advanced tactical training, approached her after a routine briefing with questions that went far beyond standard procedures. "Sergeant, I've been studying the patterns in enemy activity reports, and I think I see something that might be significant," Johnson said, showing Emma a hand-drawn chart covered with detailed annotations. "The frequency of reconnaissance probes has been increasing over the past 3 weeks, but the pattern suggests they're gathering intelligence about our northern approaches rather than probing for weaknesses." Emma studied Johnson's analysis with the same serious attention she gave to all tactical questions. "What do you think that tells us about their intentions?" Johnson's eyes lit up with the excitement of analytical discovery. "I think they might be planning to bypass our defensive positions entirely and establish a blocking position to cut off our supply routes. If they can isolate us from resupply, they could force us into a siege situation without having to assault our prepared defenses." Emma nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of analytical thinking that can prevent tactical surprises. Have you shared this assessment with the intelligence section?" Johnson's expression became uncertain. "I wasn't sure if I should. I'm just a junior enlisted soldier, and I don't have formal intelligence training." Emma's response carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Johnson, the intelligence section exists to analyze exactly this kind of information. Your rank doesn't determine the value of your observations, and your lack of formal training doesn't invalidate your analytical capabilities. If you've identified a potential threat, you have a responsibility to share that information." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Emma helping Johnson refine his analysis and prepare a formal assessment for submission to the appropriate authorities. It was a scene that would have been unimaginable before Emma's transformation of the base's culture, but had now become routine. As Johnson left to prepare his report, Emma reflected on the changes that had occurred since her arrival at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. She had come to Afghanistan as an isolated soldier struggling to find her place in a military culture that didn't value her particular strengths. She was leaving as a leader whose influence had fundamentally altered how the entire unit approached tactical thinking and problem-solving. The personal cost of her journey had been significant. Emma had endured months of isolation, professional humiliation, and psychological pressure that would have broken many soldiers. But she had also discovered reserves of strength and conviction that she hadn't known she possessed. More importantly, she had learned that true leadership wasn't about commanding others or seeking recognition. It was about using your capabilities to serve something larger than yourself, about finding ways to contribute regardless of whether others understood or appreciated your efforts, and about maintaining your integrity even when the institutional forces around you were aligned against your success. Emma's deployment was scheduled to end in 2 weeks, but her influence on Forward Operating Base Sentinel would continue long after her departure. The analytical approaches she had developed were being incorporated into standard operating procedures. The tactical innovations she had introduced were being studied and replicated at other installations. The cultural changes she had inspired were becoming part of the permanent character of the unit. Colonel Harrison had offered Emma the opportunity to extend her deployment and accept assignment to a specialized tactical analysis unit being formed at division headquarters. The position would have represented a dramatic advancement in her military career and formal recognition of her unique capabilities. Emma had politely declined, choosing instead to complete her original commitment and return to civilian life. Her decision surprised many people who assumed that she would want to capitalize on her newfound recognition and professional opportunities. "I came to Afghanistan to serve my country and protect my fellow soldiers," Emma explained to Colonel Harrison during their final meeting. "I've accomplished that mission in ways I never expected. Now it's time for me to find new ways to serve, new challenges to meet, and new people to help." Harrison studied Emma with the respect he reserved for the most exceptional soldiers he had known. "Rodriguez, you have a gift for tactical analysis that could reshape how the Army approaches modern warfare. Are you sure you want to walk away from that opportunity?" Emma's response reflected the wisdom she had gained through her extraordinary journey. "Sir, my gift isn't tactical analysis. My gift is seeing possibilities that others miss and finding ways to help people succeed despite institutional obstacles. That gift will be just as valuable in civilian life as it has been in the military." On her final day at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, Emma walked the perimeter one last time, visiting the defensive positions she had helped design and the soldiers she had trained. Each location held memories of the journey that had transformed her from an isolated logistics specialist into a leader whose influence would outlast her physical presence. At the eastern wall where she had made her stand during the battle that changed everything, Emma found a small plaque that had been installed without her knowledge. It reads simply, "In honor of those who see clearly when others cannot, who think deeply when others will not, and who stand firmly when others fall back." Emma smiled at the inscription, recognizing that it honored not just her own contributions, but the potential that existed in every soldier who approached problems from unexpected angles. The plaque wasn't a monument to her success. It was a reminder that excellence could emerge from the most unlikely sources when institutions created space for diverse thinking and unconventional approaches. As Emma prepared to leave Afghanistan, she carried with her more than just personal satisfaction at a mission completed. She carried the knowledge that she had fundamentally changed how others thought about leadership, competence, and the value of analytical thinking in high-pressure situations. The quiet logistics specialist who had been dismissed as weak and unsuitable for combat had proven that strength came in many forms, that courage was often found in persistence rather than aggression, and that the most powerful weapon in any army was a soldier who refused to accept limitations imposed by others' limited imagination. Years later, when military historians studied the evolution of tactical doctrine in the early 21st century, Emma Rodriguez's name would appear in academic papers about the integration of analytical thinking and intuitive decision-making in combat situations. But Emma herself had moved on to new challenges, carrying the lessons she had learned in Afghanistan to new contexts where they could serve new purposes. She had proven that heroes come in all forms, that courage manifests in countless ways, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against external enemies but against the internal forces that seek to limit human potential. Emma Rodriguez had won that battle decisively, and in doing so, she had opened doors for countless others who would follow in her footsteps. The woman they had called scared had shown them what real courage looked like, and the military would never be quite the same. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.